Cheating husband laughed while signing divorce papers, unaware she was 10 steps ahead, until the judge read her net worth. The pen scratched against paper as Dylan Crawford signed his name across the divorce decree, each letter bold and confident, each stroke bringing him closer to billions he'd never had to earn. The courtroom smelled like expensive leather and the end of something that should have lasted forever. Across the mahogany table, Isabelle Crawford sat perfectly still, her face revealing absolutely nothing. Dylan's attorney, Maxwell Green, slid the final page forward. "Almost done," Maxwell said cheerfully. Dylan actually laughed as he signed the last paper, the sound of a man who believed he'd just won the lottery. 3 years, he muttered loud enough for Isabelle to hear. 3 years, and it's finally paying off. His phone buzzed. Another text from his mistress waiting downstairs. He ignored it, too focused on this moment, the moment when everything changed. Isabelle slowly removed her wedding ring and placed it on the table between them, the small metallic sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. Her attorney, Patricia Vance, sat beside her with a folder so thin it looked empty. Maxwell had dismissed it weeks ago as irrelevant. Judge Andrea Lawson entered, her black robe settling around her shoulders, her reading glasses perched on a silver chain. "Let's proceed with financial disclosures." Maxwell submitted Dylan's documents first. Modest assets, nothing substantial. Patricia opened her thin folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Judge Lawson's eyes moved across the page, then stopped. She removed her glasses slowly, cleaned them, replaced them, and read again. The silence changed. Judge Lawson looked at Isabelle, then at Dylan, then back at the paper. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Mrs. Crawford, I need to confirm something before we proceed." Isabelle's voice was steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Maxwell leaned forward, trying to read the document. Patricia remained perfectly still. Dylan's legs stopped bouncing. Judge Lawson looked at Dylan with something that resembled pity, like she was watching a man who'd already lost everything and didn't know it yet. "Mr. Crawford," she said slowly, "I think you need to look at something very carefully." But what was on that paper? Why had Maxwell's face just gone pale? And why was Isabelle sitting so perfectly still, like someone who'd been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment? This story is going to teach you that wealth without protection is vulnerability, that love without wisdom is danger, and that the most powerful position in any conflict is the one where you've already won before your opponent realizes the game has started. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. Isabelle Crawford's phone buzzed on the conference table in Singapore, the screen lighting up with a message that would change everything without her knowing it yet. She picked it up and read the email from the Sterling's investment firm she'd flown 14 hours to meet with. Her eyes scanning the words that explained regulatory complications had forced them to postpone their merger discussion indefinitely. Her assistant Rachel looked up from her laptop across the polished conference room, concern crossing her face as she noticed Isabelle's expression shift from focused to disappointed. "The Sterling's meeting is canceled," Isabelle said, setting her phone down on the table between stacks of presentation folders she'd spent 3 weeks preparing. The acquisition hit unexpected government regulatory issues on their end, and they need at least another month to sort everything out before we can even begin discussions. Rachel closed her laptop and leaned forward, already thinking through backup options the way she always did when business plans shifted unexpectedly. "We could stay in Singapore for a few extra days and meet with some of the other regional investors you've been trying to connect with, or we could fly to Tokyo since you mentioned wanting to visit the manufacturing facility there." Isabelle shook her head, feeling something warm and unexpected move through her chest as an idea took shape. "No, book the jet back to Los Angeles. I want to go home now. Also call Marcus to be available at the airport." "Right now?" Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise because Isabelle Crawford never cut business trips short, never left opportunities unexplored, never chose personal time over professional advancement. But you weren't scheduled to return until Thursday evening, and Dylan isn't expecting you back for another 3 days. I know exactly when he's expecting me, which is why this is perfect. Isabelle stood from the conference table, gathering her files and sliding them into her leather portfolio with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for closing major deals. I'll surprise him with 2 extra days together, and we can actually spend some time reconnecting without me being exhausted from back-to-back meetings. Rachel smiled at that, recognizing the softness in Isabelle's voice that only appeared when she talked about her husband. He's going to love that surprise. 3 hours later, Isabelle's private Gulfstream lifted off from Changi Airport, climbing through humid Singapore air into clearer skies above the South China Sea. She settled into the leather seat and watched the city disappear below her, feeling genuinely excited about going home early for the first time in her entire career. Dylan had sent her a text message that morning while she was getting ready for the meeting that never happened. His words simple but sweet, "Missing you more than usual today. Can't wait until you're back home where you belong." The message had made her smile then, and it made her smile now as she reread it somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. They'd only been married 3 years, but some mornings she still woke up feeling grateful that she'd found someone who genuinely seemed to love her for who she was, rather than what she owned. The flight stretched across 14 hours of movies she didn't watch, and work she couldn't focus on, because her mind kept drifting to Dylan's face when she would walk through their front door 2 days early. She thought about maybe cooking dinner together, something they hadn't done in months because her schedule had been so demanding, or perhaps just ordering takeout and watching old movies on the couch the way they used to before everything got so busy. The jet finally touched down at Van Nuys Airport at precisely 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, the wheels hitting California tarmac with that gentle bump that always signaled the end of long international flights. Isabelle gathered her things and stepped out onto the stairs, immediately hit by that particular quality of Los Angeles sunshine that felt aggressive and bright after Singapore's constant humidity. Her driver Marcus stood beside the black Mercedes, opening the rear door with his usual professional efficiency and friendly smile. "Mrs. Crawford, this is unexpected but wonderful to see you back early. Should I call ahead to the house and let Mr. Crawford know you're on your way home so he can prepare something special?" "No, don't call him." Isabelle slid into the back seat, setting her small carry-on suitcase beside her while Marcus closed the door. "I want this to be a complete surprise, the kind where he has no warning at all and I just walk through the door when he's not expecting anyone." Marcus nodded with understanding and pulled away from the private terminal, navigating through the usual Los Angeles traffic that seemed determined to slow down every journey, regardless of time or destination. Isabelle sat back and watched the city pass by her window, residential neighborhoods giving way to the hills and trees that marked the approach to Bel Air. Dylan had mentioned during their last phone call 2 nights ago that he was taking the entire week off from his consulting work to relax and catch up on projects around the house, which meant he was almost certainly home right now, probably reading in his office or maybe watching sports in the living room. The drive took 35 minutes through traffic that wasn't terrible but wasn't great either, the kind of moderate congestion that Angelenos just accepted as normal life. Their neighborhood finally appeared, with its tree-lined streets and private gates, each property hidden behind walls and hedges that spoke of money and privacy in equal measure. The iron gates recognized Marcus's car and swung open automatically with that smooth mechanical hum that expensive security systems made, revealing the long driveway that curved toward their house. The property appeared through the trees looking exactly as it always did. Modern white stone and floor-to-ceiling glass walls that had cost more than most people made in a lifetime, designed by an architect whose waiting list was 3 years long. Isabelle had bought this house 4 years ago, before she'd even met Dylan, back when she was still thinking of it as just her space rather than their home. Marcus brought the car to a stop near the front entrance and came around to open her door. "Do you need help bringing your luggage inside, Mrs. Crawford?" "Just hand me the carry-on. I can manage that myself." Isabelle took the small suitcase from him, its wheels clicking softly against the stone driveway. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll see you tomorrow morning for the usual pickup time." She walked toward the front door with her suitcase rolling behind her, fishing her keys from her purse and feeling that flutter of anticipation about Dylan's reaction when he saw her standing there 2 days ahead of schedule. Her key slid into the lock and turned smoothly, the deadbolt clicking open with that solid sound that expensive locks made. The door swung inward, and cool air-conditioned air rushed out to meet the warm afternoon, the temperature difference creating that momentary sensation of crossing from one world into another. The foyer stretched before her with its white marble floors reflecting light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, everything pristine and quiet and exactly as she'd left it 4 days ago. She opened her mouth to call Dylan's name, to announce her surprise arrival with excitement and anticipation. Then she heard his voice coming from the living room around the corner, and something about his tone made her mouth close without making a sound. He was talking on the phone with someone, his voice carrying that particular quality of intimacy and excitement that she recognized because it used to be reserved for conversations with her. "Baby, don't worry about anything. I promise you this is all going exactly according to plan." Isabelle's hand froze on her suitcase handle, her entire body going still in the foyer as her brain tried to process what she was hearing. "In 2 weeks, the papers will be ready and signed, and everything will finally be finished," Dylan continued, his voice getting slightly louder as though he was pacing closer to where Isabelle stood, hidden in the foyer. "And I will be leaving with half of all she had, every single dollar and property and asset, split right down the middle like the law says." The marble floor beneath Isabelle's feet suddenly felt unstable, like the entire house had shifted on its foundation while she stood there trying to understand words that didn't make sense coming from her husband's mouth. "If not for her money, I wouldn't marry someone like her, you know that," Dylan said, and then he laughed. Actually laughed like this was funny, like 3 years of marriage was some kind of joke. "Finally, I will be rich on my own, and I'll take you around the world to all those places we've been planning, Paris and Bali and everywhere else." Someone like her. The phrase hit Isabelle's chest like something physical and heavy, knocking the air from her lungs and making her heart slam against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her fingers went numb around the suitcase handle, her entire body flooding with adrenaline and shock, and something else she couldn't identify because she'd never felt it before in her entire life. She heard Dylan's footsteps moving across the living room floor, heading toward the foyer, getting closer to where she stood, frozen and processing, and trying to decide what to do in the space of seconds. Her mind, trained by years of high stakes, business negotiations and split-second decisions worth millions of dollars, suddenly clicked into a different mode entirely. Cold, calculating, strategic in a way that had nothing to do with mergers and everything to do with survival. Isabelle made her choice in less than 2 seconds. She stepped backward through the still open door as quietly as possible, pulling it almost closed but not latching it, then immediately pushed it open again with enough force to make it bang against the doorstop. "Dylan, honey, I'm home early." Her voice came out bright and cheerful and completely normal, like she'd just arrived this second and heard absolutely nothing. She walked into the foyer, pulling her suitcase behind her, the wheels clicking against marble, her face arranged into an expression of happy surprise that felt like a mask she'd never worn before. Dylan appeared around the corner from the living room, his phone nowhere visible, his face showing perfect surprise that looked so genuine it made Isabelle's stomach turn. "Isabelle, what are you doing home?" He crossed the foyer quickly and pulled her into a hug, kissing her cheek with lips that felt exactly the same as they always had. "I thought you weren't coming back until Thursday evening." "The Sterling's meeting got canceled at the last minute," Isabelle said, watching his eyes carefully while keeping her own expression open and unsuspecting. "Some regulatory complications on their end that's going to take at least another month to resolve. So instead of staying in Singapore, I just decided to come straight home and surprise you." "Well, you definitely surprised me in the best possible way." Dylan took her suitcase from her hand, setting it beside the stairs with casual familiarity. "I'm really happy you're here. This is perfect." He looked happy, his smile reaching his eyes, his body language relaxed and welcoming in exactly the way it always was when she came home from trips. Isabelle felt something cold settle in her stomach, spreading through her chest and arms and legs until her entire body felt like it was operating at a different temperature than normal. "Let me order some dinner for us," she said, keeping her voice warm and natural despite everything screaming inside her head. "We can have a nice quiet evening together since I'm home unexpectedly early." "That sounds absolutely perfect." Dylan walked toward the kitchen, calling back over his shoulder. "I'll open some wine for us. We should celebrate you being home." He disappeared around the corner and Isabelle stood alone in the foyer, in the house she'd bought with her money, married to the man who'd just said he wouldn't have married someone like her without it. 2 weeks, he'd said. The papers would be ready in 2 weeks. Isabelle pulled her phone from her purse and looked at the screen, her thumb hovering over her contacts list where Patricia Vance's name sat under the letter V. Patricia had handled all of Isabelle's estate planning and asset protection before the wedding, setting up structures and trusts and legal frameworks that Isabelle had insisted on. She put the phone back in her purse without calling anyone. Not yet. She needed to think first, needed to understand exactly what was happening before she made any moves that Dylan might notice or question. She needed to be smart about this, needed to use the same strategic thinking that had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing. Dylan's voice called from the kitchen, cheerful and loving and completely false. "Red wine or white wine?" "Red is perfect," Isabelle called back, her voice steady and normal and giving away absolutely nothing about the calculations already running through her mind. She walked toward the kitchen where her husband was pouring wine, where he would smile at her and toast to her unexpected homecoming, where he would play the role of loving husband for exactly 14 more days before those papers he'd mentioned were ready to sign. "Someone like her," he'd said. Isabelle smiled as she entered the kitchen, taking the wine glass Dylan offered with a hand that didn't shake even slightly. He had absolutely no idea who someone like her really was, but he was going to find out in exactly 2 weeks, and by then it would be far too late for him to do anything about it. The wine tasted like metal in Isabelle's mouth, but she smiled and took another sip, while Dylan talked about his week as though nothing in the world was wrong. They sat on the leather couch in the living room, with the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Los Angeles skyline beginning to light up as evening approached. The view worth millions of dollars that Isabelle had paid for with money Dylan was currently planning to take half of in 2 weeks. He was telling her about a book he'd been reading, some thriller about a con artist who fooled an entire city, and the irony wasn't lost on Isabelle as she nodded and asked questions and played the role of interested wife. His hand rested on her knee the way it always did when they sat together, warm and familiar, and now feeling like something completely different that made her skin crawl beneath her calm exterior. "How was Singapore before the meeting fell apart?" Dylan asked, refilling her wine glass, even though she'd barely touched what was already there. "Did you at least get to see some of the city Or were you stuck in conference rooms the whole time? Mostly conference rooms and hotel business centers. You know how these trips go, Isabelle said, watching his face for any sign of the man she'd heard on the phone. But he looked exactly like the Dylan she'd known for 3 years. Rachel and I did have one nice dinner overlooking the harbor, but otherwise it was all preparation for a meeting that never happened, which makes the whole trip feel like wasted time now. Dylan squeezed her knee sympathetically, his touch gentle and his eyes full of what looked like genuine concern. At least you're home now, and we have 2 unexpected days together before you have to jump back into the chaos of your schedule. 2 days that he hadn't planned for, Isabelle realized. 2 days that probably complicated whatever timeline he'd been working toward with his mysterious phone call about papers being ready. She filed that information away in the part of her brain that was working overtime to analyze every word, every gesture, every moment for clues about what was really happening in her marriage. Dinner arrived 40 minutes later, the food from the restaurant they'd gone to on their first date 3 years ago, and Dylan set the table in the dining room with candles and good plates like this was something special. Isabelle watched him move around their home, this man she'd married and trusted and built a life with, and tried to reconcile the person she'd thought she knew with the voice she'd heard saying he wouldn't have married someone like her without the money. They ate and talked about ordinary things, television shows and weekend plans, and whether they should finally take that trip to Italy. They'd been discussing for months. Dylan seemed relaxed and happy and completely normal, laughing at appropriate moments and asking about her mother's health and mentioning that the landscaper had done something wrong with the hedges that needed to be fixed. "I missed this," Dylan said halfway through dinner, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Just you and me. No distractions, no work emergencies, just being together like we used to be before everything got so busy." Isabelle looked at their joined hands, his fingers intertwined with hers, and wondered how many times he'd touched her while thinking about leaving with half of everything she owned. "I missed this too," she said, and part of that was true because she did miss what she'd thought they had before she'd heard that phone call. They finished dinner, and Dylan insisted on cleaning up, while Isabelle went upstairs to unpack her suitcase, and she used those 15 minutes alone in their bedroom to finally let her face show what she was feeling. She sat on the edge of their bed and stared at the wall, her hands shaking now that no one was watching, her mind racing through possibilities and plans and questions that had no answers yet. Isabelle stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of Los Angeles spreading across the hills, and valleys like a blanket of stars that had fallen to earth. Somewhere out there was the woman Dylan had called baby, the woman he was planning to take around the world with Isabelle's money, the woman who knew about papers being ready in 2 weeks. Dylan's footsteps sounded on the stairs, coming up to find her, and Isabelle rearranged her face back into the expression of a woman who suspected nothing. He appeared in the doorway of their bedroom, smiling that smile she used to love, and crossed the room to wrap his arms around her from behind. "I'm really glad you're home," he said softly, his chin resting on her shoulder while they both looked out at the city lights. "These past few days without you felt longer than usual for some reason." Because he was counting down to freedom, Isabelle thought, because he was marking time until those papers were ready, and he could finally cash out of this marriage he'd never wanted except for what it could give him. "I'm glad to be home too," she said instead, leaning back against him the way she always did, playing her part perfectly. They stood like that for several minutes, Dylan holding his wife while she held information he didn't know she had, both of them performing for each other in different ways for completely different reasons. The city lights blurred slightly as tears formed in Isabelle's eyes, but she blinked them away before Dylan could see, because crying would raise questions, and questions would lead to conversations she couldn't have yet. "Let's go to bed early," Dylan suggested, kissing the side of her neck. You must be exhausted from the flight and the time difference." Isabelle nodded and pulled away from his embrace, heading toward the bathroom to change into pajamas and wash her face and stare at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger now, someone who'd been fooled for 3 entire years by a man who saw her as nothing more than a bank account with a wedding ring. She brushed her teeth and removed her makeup and went through all the normal nighttime rituals while her mind worked on problems that had nothing to do with skincare or sleep. Dylan was already in bed when she emerged from the bathroom, the covers pulled back on her side, his phone face down on the nightstand in a way that suddenly seemed significant. Isabelle climbed into bed beside the man who was planning to divorce her in 2 weeks, turned off her bedside lamp and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. Dylan's breathing evened out within minutes, falling asleep easily like someone without guilt or conscience or any awareness that his entire plan was already falling apart. She lay awake for hours, listening to him sleep, counting down the days she had left to figure out exactly how to make sure that when those papers were finally ready to sign, Dylan Crawford would discover that someone like her was someone he should never have tried to deceive. 14 days, she thought. 13 now, technically, since it was past midnight. Isabelle closed her eyes and started planning, because that's what someone like her did best. The 2 weeks after Isabelle heard that phone call passed in careful silence, every breakfast and dinner a performance she perfected with each passing day. She smiled when Dylan spoke, laughed at his jokes, kissed him goodnight, and all the while her mind worked through strategies and calculations that had nothing to do with the loving wife she pretended to be. On day 15, they sat at their dining room table eating the pasta Dylan had ordered from their favorite Italian restaurant, the same place where they'd celebrated their first anniversary with champagne and promises about forever. The candles flickered between them, casting shadows across Dylan's face as he set down his fork and reached into his jacket pocket. "Isabelle, we need to talk about something," Dylan said, pulling out a folded stack of papers and placing them on the table between their plates. "I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I don't think this marriage is working anymore." Isabelle looked at the papers, then at his face, seeing nothing there that looked like regret or sadness or anything except barely concealed excitement. "You want a divorce?" "I think it's best for both of us," Dylan said, sliding the papers closer to her across the polished wood. "My attorney already drew everything up, and according to California law, you know how this works. We split everything 50-50, clean and simple, and we both move on with our lives." She picked up the papers and flipped through them slowly, seeing her company listed, her properties detailed, her assets calculated down to the last dollar. "You want half of everything I built before I even met you." "That's how community property works in California," Dylan said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "You're a smart businesswoman. You understand the law. Just sign the papers and don't make a fuss about this, and we can get through it quickly without dragging things out." Isabelle set the papers down carefully, folding her hands on top of them. "No." Dylan's expression shifted from confident to irritated. "No? What do you mean, no? You don't get to just refuse, Isabelle. This is happening whether you want it to or not." "I mean, I'm not signing anything tonight," Isabelle said, her voice calm and steady. "If you want a divorce, we'll do it properly. We'll meet in court, present everything to a judge, and let the law decide what happens to our assets." "There's nothing to decide," Dylan said, his voice rising slightly. "California is a community property state, which means I'm entitled to half, and your little power play of refusing to sign won't change that fact." Isabelle stood from the table, leaving the divorce papers where they lay, between the remains of their dinner. "Then I guess we'll see what the judge says. Have your attorney contact mine to schedule the hearing." She walked upstairs without looking back, leaving Dylan sitting alone at the dining table with papers he'd been so certain she would sign without question. Behind the closed bedroom door, Isabelle finally allowed herself to breathe deeply, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled out her phone and typed a message to Patricia Vance. He served me the papers, demanding half of everything. Time to show him what he's actually entitled to. Patricia's response came within seconds. I'll file our response tomorrow. See you in court. The next month crawled by with Dylan moving out to an apartment his attorney helped him find, the house suddenly empty except for Isabelle, and the silence that filled rooms where lies had been told for 3 years. He called twice asking her to reconsider, to just sign the papers and avoid court costs, his voice carrying that tone of someone who thought he was being reasonable while planning robbery. She never answered his calls. The courtroom appeared exactly as Isabelle had imagined it during those long nights of planning, wood paneling and fluorescent lights and the weight of justice that either worked or failed, depending on who had prepared better. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia beside her, watching Dylan enter with Maxwell Green, both of them carrying folders thick with documents that detailed every asset they planned to claim half of. Dylan looked confident, almost happy, his suit expensive and new, like he'd already spent money he thought was coming. He glanced at Isabelle once across the courtroom aisle, and something in his expression suggested he thought this was already over, that the judge would simply sign papers and hand him billions. Judge Andrea Lawson entered through the door behind the bench, her black robe settling around her as she took her seat. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and her face carried the neutral expression of someone who'd presided over hundreds of divorces and thought she'd seen every variation of human greed and stupidity. Please be seated, Judge Lawson said, arranging papers in front of her. We're here for the dissolution of marriage between Dylan Crawford and Isabelle Crawford, with the primary issue being division of marital assets. Let's proceed with financial disclosures. Maxwell stood immediately, approaching the bench with his thick folder of documents. Your Honor, we've prepared extensive financial disclosures for both parties. Mr. Crawford's assets are modest, approximately $87,000 in personal savings and retirement accounts. He placed papers in front of the judge. Mrs. Crawford, however, has extensive assets, including her business enterprises, valued at $4.3 billion, real estate holdings in 3 states, investment portfolios, and various other properties. Judge Lawson accepted the documents and began reading through them, her expression remaining neutral, as she scanned page after page of asset listings that Maxwell had clearly spent weeks compiling. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his leg bouncing with that nervous energy that Isabelle now recognized as excitement rather than anxiety. He whispered something to Maxwell, who nodded and smiled like they were sharing a private joke about how easy this was going to be. Mrs. Crawford's financial disclosure. Judge Lawson looked at Patricia expectantly. Patricia stood, carrying only that thin folder that looked almost empty compared to Maxwell's extensive documentation. She walked to the bench with measured steps and placed a single sheet of paper in front of the judge. Judge Lawson picked up the paper, her eyes moving across it in the practiced way of someone who read legal documents quickly and thoroughly. Then her eyes stopped moving entirely, her whole body going still as she stared at the page. She removed her glasses slowly, cleaned them on her robe, replaced them, and read the document again from the beginning. The silence in the courtroom stretched and changed, becoming something thick and expectant that made Dylan's leg stop bouncing. Judge Lawson's eyebrows climbed slowly toward her hairline as she looked from the paper to Isabelle, then to Dylan, then back to the paper again. Her expression shifted from neutral to confused, to something that looked almost like she wanted to laugh but knew she shouldn't. Mrs. Crawford, Judge Lawson said slowly, emphasizing each word, I need to confirm the information on this disclosure before we proceed. Yes, Your Honor, Isabelle said, her voice steady. Maxwell half rose from his seat, trying to see what was on that single page. Your Honor, is there a problem with the disclosure? Judge Lawson set the paper down and looked directly at Dylan with an expression that mixed pity with disbelief. Mr. Crawford, I think you need to look at something very carefully. What is it? Dylan's voice carried irritation and confusion. Is there some kind of clerical error? No error. Judge Lawson picked up the paper again. According to Mrs. Crawford's financial disclosure, her total personal net worth is $0. The words hit the courtroom like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Dylan's face went blank, his mouth opening without sound coming out. What? That's impossible. She's worth billions. Her company alone is... Her business enterprises are worth $4.3 billion, Judge Lawson interrupted, reading from the document. However, these assets are not owned by Isabelle Crawford personally. They are owned and protected by an irrevocable trust established 4 years ago, 6 months before your marriage. The color drained from Dylan's face like someone had opened a tap. A trust? What are you talking about? Patricia spoke for the first time, her voice clear and professional. An irrevocable trust was established by Mrs. Crawford 4 years ago on the advice of legal counsel for asset protection purposes. The trust owns her business enterprises, all real estate properties including the Bel Air residence, all vehicles, the art collection, investment portfolios, and all other significant assets. Mrs. Crawford is the beneficiary and trustee, but she does not own these assets personally. Maxwell was on his feet, his face flushing red. Your Honor, this is fraud. She deliberately hid assets from discovery. She did nothing of the kind, Judge Lawson said sharply. An irrevocable trust is a completely legal structure for asset protection. Mrs. Crawford's personal financial disclosure is accurate. She personally owns nothing because everything is held in trust. Dylan stood up so fast his chair fell backward and clattered against the floor. No, this can't be right. She can't do this. Your Honor, you have to stop this. Mr. Crawford, sit down, Judge Lawson ordered. There is nothing to stop. Irrevocable trusts are established precisely for this purpose, and this particular trust was created long before you married Mrs. Crawford. Before we were married? Dylan's voice climbed higher, panic bleeding through every word. She planned this. She knew she was going to divorce me, and she protected her assets before entering into any marriage, Judge Lawson interrupted, which is not only legal but frankly advisable for anyone with significant wealth. The trust documents are all properly filed legally, sound, and established well before your relationship began. Dylan turned to stare at Isabelle, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, rage, disbelief, horror. You knew. When you heard me on the phone, you knew you were protected. Isabelle met his eyes without flinching. I heard you tell your girlfriend that you wouldn't have married someone like me without my money. I heard you laugh about leaving with half of everything I built. So yes, I knew exactly who you were, and I was very grateful that my attorney convinced me to establish that trust years ago. This is insane, Dylan's voice broke, desperation replacing anger. Your Honor, there has to be something. The house, the cars, anything. All owned by the trust, Patricia said calmly. Mrs. Crawford lives in the Bel Air property as a beneficiary of the trust, but she does not own it. The same applies to all vehicles and other assets. Judge Lawson signed the divorce decree with firm strokes of her pen. Mr. Crawford, under California community property law, you are entitled to 50% of all marital assets. According to these financial disclosures, the marital assets total $0. Therefore, you receive 50% of zero, which is zero. No! The sound that came out of Dylan was barely human, a scream of pure rage and anguish combined. Isabelle, please, you can't do this to me. I'm not doing anything to you, Isabelle said quietly. The law is simply giving you exactly what you're entitled to. half of what we built together during our marriage, which is nothing. Maxwell grabbed Dylan's arm, trying to calm him down, but Dylan shook him off violently. Isabelle, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Please, we can fix this. Give me another chance. Isabelle stood, gathering her purse while Patricia collected the thin folder. You had 3 years of chances, Dylan. You spent every single day of those 3 years lying to me, using me, planning to rob me. Now you have exactly what you deserve. The marriage is dissolved, Judge Lawson announced. Mr. Crawford, you are free to leave with the assets you brought into this marriage. Mrs. Crawford retains her position as trustee and beneficiary of her irrevocable trust. This hearing is adjourned. Dylan lunged toward Isabelle, but Maxwell caught him, holding him back as he continued shouting, Please, Isabelle, I love you. I'll do anything. Don't leave me with nothing. You're not leaving with nothing, Isabelle said, turning at the courtroom doors to look at him one final time. You're leaving with exactly what you brought into our marriage, which apparently was just lies and greed. Goodbye, Dylan. She walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, Patricia beside her, the sound of Dylan's begging and screaming fading as the heavy doors swung shut behind them. The courthouse hallway felt bright and open after the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, and Isabelle took a deep breath that felt like the first real breath she'd taken in a month. Thank you, she said to Patricia, for insisting I set up that trust 4 years ago, even when I thought it was unnecessary paranoia. It's never paranoia to protect yourself, Patricia replied. I'm just sorry you had to discover why it was necessary. Isabelle walked out of the courthouse into California sunshine that felt warmer and brighter than it had in weeks. Her car waited at the curb, Marcus holding the door open, and she slid into the back seat feeling lighter than she'd felt since that moment she'd heard Dylan's voice on the phone. Dylan Crawford had served her divorce papers, demanding half of billions he'd never earned, never built, never deserved. He'd laughed about marrying her only for money, called her someone like her, with contempt in his voice, planned to take his mistress around the world on Isabelle's fortune. Instead, he'd walked out of that courtroom with $0 and the knowledge that someone like her was someone who always stayed 10 steps ahead. Isabelle looked out the window as Marcus drove away from the courthouse, watching the building disappear behind them. Dylan was probably still inside, still begging, still trying to understand how his perfect plan had collapsed into nothing. But that wasn't her problem anymore. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her executive team. I'm back. Schedule a board meeting for Monday. We have work to do. Someone like her didn't waste time on men who'd proven themselves worthless. Someone like her built empires instead. This story teaches us that wealth without protection is just a target. Dylan saw billions and thought he'd found an easy mark. What he actually found was a woman who understood that accumulating money and protecting money require completely different skills. She had both. He had neither. Viewers, do you think Dylan deserves a second chance? Drop your thought in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.